What are large language models models of? This is a reprise of a talk that I gave recently at a Dagstuhl Seminar on Linguistics and Language Models. The goal of the talk was to get people thinking and talking about the issues I was raising, and it seems like it was reasonably successful. So I've decided to put together this video and get it out there in hopes of prompting even broader discussion. In that original presentation, I went through some slides kind of quickly for lack of time, and I actually think the talk was somewhat the better for it, so I'm going to do the same thing here for some of those same slides. To begin with, I want you to imagine the following scenario. There are two aliens, let's call them Abbott and Costello, who have arrived on Earth from a distant galaxy with their own completely separate 20 billion years of evolution. Inside their enclosure, we expose them to tons and tons of human language, and they turn out to be incredibly good at it. In addition, they're incredibly generous, and they volunteer to let us do whatever experiments we want going into whatever it is that they have that corresponds to brains. I want you to keep this scenario in the back of your mind, and we'll be coming back to it. First, though, let's think about what we mean by model in the context of this discussion. A model is a way of embodying a scientific theory or explanation of something. And the role of any theory or explanation or model, first, is to make predictions that can be verified against data. Although sometimes people talk about quote-unquote raw data, it's important to remember that in science there's actually no such thing. The present state of your theory always provides guidance on which data are the right data to collect and which are the right measurements to make. The second role of a theory is, of course, to provide us with understanding of the phenomena we care about. We start with our theory in some current state, we bring it into contact with data and take measurements, we interpret and analyze our results, and finally, those results tell us how we should update our understanding and our theory. Except, it's not actually finally. This is a continuous, hopefully virtuous cycle that continuously moves from our present theories and explanations to the data, then back again over and over, helping us to increase our understanding, and hopefully also helping us to refine and update the questions that we're asking. In this talk, the thing we're trying to understand, the thing we want a model of, is the human cognitive system for processing language. And the core question that I'm taking up is how we should view large language models as models in that sense for those human cognitive capacities. At one extreme, you might say that large language models have nothing whatsoever to contribute to our scientific understanding of how those capabilities work. At the other end, you might say that LLMs are scientifically useful models in that kind of cognitive theory development. The question in this talk is where we should think of large language models as being situated with respect to that sense of what it means to be a model. To structure the discussion, I'm going to make use of Marr's well-known levels of explanation, which I assume people are familiar with. His distinctions between the implementation level of explanation, the algorithmic and representational level, and the computational theory level are of course not perfect, but they can be very useful. Let's start at the implementation level. Since the early days of neural network or connectionist models, people have been excited about them because they have properties that are inspired by the biological implementation in human brains. Their obvious physiological flavor. The people who kicked off all that research on connectionism in the 1980s were certainly inspired in that way, and back then I used to find connectionism pretty inspiring for the same reasons. But there's a problem with this. The problem is that to the extent that these models are inspired by neuroscience, they're inspired by a version of neuroscience that was current in the 1950s and basically hasn't been updated since then. Not only that, but it's worth noting that a crucial step in developing these models as they exist today was actually an explicit decision to abandon the idea of being inspired by biology. There's a great interview you can find on YouTube in which Jay McClellan talks about the history here, and he points out that when Jeff Hinton saw the problems they were having making progress, he told them, look, the way you've been going about this is wrong because you've been trying to mimic biology. What you really should be doing is just focusing on optimization. What you want to do is optimize a loss function relative to the task that you care about. And so a crucial step in connectionism was actually to abandon this kind of neuroscientific implementation level modeling that we're talking about here. But in the past half century or so, we've discovered a whole lot more about what brains do. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on details. During the original talk, I basically just flashed some examples here on this slide. But as a couple of highlights, we know that dendrites are not just wires carrying scalar values. They actually do computations. We know that there are many different kinds of neurons, and there are even different kinds of synapses that follow different learning rules. It's not all just one big uniform learning system at the micro level. And it's also very different at a higher level from what we thought the brain looked like in the 1950s in terms of that higher level architecture. So, if you actually take the time to look at what we've learned about the brain since the early inspirations of connectionism, basically your head's going to explode. There is so much there that's new and fascinating, and there are people working on computational models that are actually informed by what we've learned about human implementation in the last 50 to 70 years. But what they're doing has had pretty much no influence on LLMs. The bottom line is that in terms of MAR, LLMs aren't even a decent candidate as an implementation level model, and they're far from the only game in town. What about the algorithmic representational level? Again, when you go back to the roots of today's neural network models, the ideas really were connected with the desire to have computationally and psychologically accurate mechanistic accounts of human cognition. And a lot of optimism about these things serving in that role. And I want to say, I actually do buy that models of this kind really do have important elements to offer in that regard. In particular, I want to call out representation learning as what I really think of as the most important aspect of these models, the automatic learning of these continuously valued representational spaces, as opposed to either the purely symbolic knowledge and rules or feature engineering that you found in older approaches. But that said, when we talk about the algorithmic and representational level, there are things that we know about human mechanisms in our sensory and cognitive systems that just don't correspond to the way these models are constructed. One well-known point is that transformers are synchronous and time-locked, but I think even more important, transformers are fundamentally a feed-forward model. They're bottom-up rather than using top-down prediction in how they process information. But there's good evidence, and there has been for a long time, that what's going on in our sensory and cognitive processing involves a very different kind of mechanism, a process of continuous top-down prediction coming from our internal models, bringing these predictions into contact with bottom-up evidence, generating an error signal, and then updating the underlying internal model that generated the predictions, and basically doing this process continually. It's a fundamentally Bayesian approach, and in fact, people argue for a Bayesian brain hypothesis where the top-down predictions can be thought of as priors, the bottom-up evidence comes into contact with this, and then we use the error signal to compute posteriors. At the algorithmic level, predictive coding models are an implementation of this idea that are dramatically more plausible biologically in terms of things we've learned about mechanisms in the brain. It's also worth noting that at least some people, me, some folks I've been working with, for example, have been working on predictive coding models for online sentence processing. As a good example, one of the very few predictive coding models involving language came out of Gina Cooperberg's lab recently in work led by Samer Noor-Eddin. As another example, Chibuka Ohams led recent work that we did on a temporal predictive coding model, one that takes the sequential nature of language into account. Samer's now working with me as a postdoc, and we're working on putting these two things together to create the first temporal and hierarchical predictive coding model for human sentence processing. The bottom line here is that LLMs are not the only game in town when it comes to mechanistic modeling of sentence processing, and they're definitely not the best game in town in terms of what we know about algorithms and the brain. Now, having said that, I actually want to make a more in-principle argument having to do with the algorithmic representational level. Recall our friends Abbott and Costello, who are the aliens with their own big, long, separate lines of evolution, and they've managed to achieve remarkable language processing capabilities by learning from lots and lots of human-generated data. Here's the question I want to ask. Why should anyone imagine that under the hood, Abbott and Costello are using human-like mechanisms? One answer to this might be the following. Doesn't doing a good job at solving the same problems suggest that the mechanisms of the solutions are similar? I mean, if you have something that's great at human language, surely it must be doing something similar to what people are doing, right? That's a kind of argument you see all the time, and I want to argue that the argument simply doesn't hold water. Here are a couple of examples. Here's the mud skipper, which, like many other animals that live in semi-aquatic environments, needs to find ways of keeping its eyes moist. That's the problem. But its solution doesn't involve eyelids, even though lots of other animals solving the same problem do have eyelids. Here's another example. Dolphins and sharks have very, very similar problems of identifying and locating prey in low-visibility aquatic environments. And yet, dolphins do this by echolocation, and sharks do it by something completely different, an incredible sensitivity to small voltage differences. It's basically an electrical solution, as opposed to a sonar-like solution. Extraordinarily similar problem, wildly different solutions. What this illustrates is that the mechanisms that nature comes up with are not just a function of the problem. They're a function of the evolutionary path to that solution. If you look at the evolutionary tree, sharks and dolphins are incredibly far apart. We can get further insight into this issue by looking at how other disciplines choose their model organisms for studying important mechanisms that they care about. And what you find is it's not just the overt observable behavior of the organism. There are also independent reasons why that is the right model organism for the job, why we believe that what we learned from that organism should transfer over to human beings. Here's a slide I put together with a bunch of examples of different kinds of animals that are used as models in medical research. And the important thing to note is that the choices depend not just on external observables. They depend on things we already know about the internal mechanisms, often on the basis of evolutionary similarity or other previously discovered similarities that we know are relevant. So, for example, we use a mouse to study cancer as opposed to a rat, because relevant genes are shared and they have similar relevant pathways. We use rats in studying cardiovascular disease because we know something about their cardiovascular disease mechanisms in relation to what humans do. Pigs are used in researching diabetes because their insulin differs from human insulin by only one amino acid. The list goes on. The main point here is that it's not just a surface similarity. There's also a basis having to do with independent motivations, grounded in what we've already discovered. We have actual reasons to believe that the particular animal, the particular model organism is going to tell us something valuable that we want to know about human beings. So if you look at things that way, Abbott and Costello are, at least a couple of light years off of the relevant evolutionary tree. And I would argue that maybe if we're generous, large language models might be a little bit closer. But even that isn't particularly clear. I mean, if you want to study what humans are doing, I could argue that my dog Remy is a better model organism for relevant aspects of what we're doing in cognition. Let's look at that example. In this photo, Remy's scared of a thunderstorm, and he's huddled up on a bunch of our clothes because the smells are reassuring. Right there we have a connection we've all experienced between familiarity and positive emotions, a connection Daniel Kahneman established in some of his research. Remy is good at processing prosody in order to interpret important aspects of what we're saying. He remembers associations between words and objects in the world. Remy is super at detecting emotion, and underneath all of these capabilities, we have lots of evolutionary and physiological evidence that Remy's brain is accomplishing these things by mechanisms that are a heck of a lot more similar to our brains than to an LLM. Now, I'm not really suggesting that we study Remy, although there is, in fact, an emerging literature on people using dogs as model organisms for studying human emotional and cognitive mechanisms. What I would say, however, is that there are other models that we know have properties that are closer to Remy and closer to us, the predictive coding models being an example. Finally, let's talk about the computational level of explanation. It goes without saying that people are very, very, very impressed by how amazing large language models are at producing human-like language and in doing some things that seem similar to how humans do things. What I want to do here is get past that gut reaction and think a little more critically about what those similarities do and don't necessarily tell us. Here's an example where we have a human producing some language, and let's imagine that I have an LLM and also one of our alien friends. And let's imagine that they're all behaving in really, really similar ways. They're producing essentially the same language. The argument from amazingness is that this provides evidence that there's something computationally similar we care about in what they're doing. Now, I've already made some arguments about why we should be skeptical about that in terms of Mars' algorithmic level, but let's delve in a little bit further with a specific example to try to make the argument a little bit crisper and to connect it to the computational theory level also. Take the example I just gave you, and instead of producing human language, let's imagine the behavior we're observing involves pairs of numbers. We have to say exactly the same thing we said a moment ago, right? The observable behavior at this level should be telling us something useful about the computation. But let's look at the numbers in this example. If you haven't already noticed it, all three of these organic or inorganic devices are computing the factorial function. But one might be computing via iteration, and another might have a very different ability to compute using recursion. Now, yes, strictly at the input-output level, they're the same. But the reason we, as cognitive scientists, care about the computational level of explanation is not just about input and output. It's also about the goals and rationales for the computation. We invest in computational level characterizations because we believe they'll have some connection to what's happening algorithmically, just as we believe an algorithmic characterization will ultimately connect with implementation. We want to say that if we characterize this computational level and the characterizations support some kind of similarity, then it's going to be valuable in terms of the mechanisms we'd ultimately like to understand. And the point I'm making here is that just looking at what you have on the surface is not going to give you that. I actually want to argue that what we're seeing here is a familiar problem that a lot of people have criticized in other contexts. Chomsky's theoretical approach is a more computation-level theory for central aspects of human language, but I, and I think many others, have long been frustrated by what you might think of as the physics envy in Chomsky's approach, the desire to get to one incredibly unified solution, a really small set of equations that accounts for everything. It's an approach where, for example, seeking a very lean and elegant theoretical story winds up giving you very complicated implicit structural analyses for very simple sentences. But here's the thing. Although accounting for everything within exactly the same elegant framework is a useful goal in theoretical physics, it's not a very good match for what happens in biology. A natural biological system builds on what existed before. When there are new selective pressures or opportunities, it's not like biology is going to take a step back, refactor the whole system, and then put everything into a nice uniform framework again. That's not how evolution works. Evolution, it is widely agreed, is a scavenger, not a designer. I think we're making the same mistake here with large language models if we're thinking about them as models of cognition. People are leaning heavily into the idea that there's one uniform solution that's going to account for everything without any strong reasons to believe that's the way the real system works. The community is now confidently waving an anti-Chomsky battle flag. And yet, ironically, I'd argue it's making the same mistake that you find in this aspect of Chomskyan linguistics. The problem with taking this approach is that it provides absolutely no guarantees, nor even any real reason to believe in ultimate transparency between what you learn about this lovely unified computation level theory and what's actually happening mechanistically in the biological real-world system. There are other arguments you can make about the computational level of explanation. Other reasons LLMs are potentially problematic as an approach. Without dwelling on the details, there are some good reasons to think that LLMs are too powerful to be the right approach as cognitive models for human language. And as an example of how cognitive models are trending, let me note that when you look at surprisal theory, which has been a very productive computation-level model in sentence processing, what you find is an increasing momentum away from black box language modeling toward models that bring in lossy storage and retrieval of contexts, recency effects, finer-grained representational distinctions, other considerations that go beyond plain old LLMs to incorporate our increased knowledge about underlying mechanisms in human linguistic cognition. So, where does that lead us? What I've tried to do here is to make the argument that regardless of which level of explanation we're looking at, none of them involve a compelling case for LLMs as cognitive models. And if there's one thing to take away from this talk, it's that the amazing behavioral capabilities of these models should not be taken to logically imply that they must be doing something that's relevant from a cognitive modeling perspective. Now, having said that, I do want to say that I do think LLMs are a game changer, just not as cognitive models per se. I think the right use case here for LLMs is as powerful tools that can serve as components of actual cognitive models. If you're building a cognitive model, there are times when you need distributional representations or contextual representations. There are times when you need a proxy for world knowledge or a stand-in for the kinds of plausible inferences that people make, and so on. LLMs can be very good at these things, and they can serve as the missing jigsaw puzzle pieces that make the whole thing fit together, even if you're not committing to the idea that the LLM itself is supposed to be an actual model for any part of the human cognitive process. This is true for any computational model you implement. Some parts of your implementation are there for representing actual hypotheses or claims. Other parts are there as a way to make the whole thing work end to end. What's important is to be explicit about which is which. As I move toward the end here, I want to make a broader comment about where we are as a field and about how deeply impressed people are with large language models and where that's leading us, because I don't think it's leading us in the right direction. The picture on the left is from the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, which killed something on the order of 50 million people worldwide. At the time, it was an open question whether flu should be characterized bacterially or as a virus, and the research community converged pretty much entirely on the theory that flu was caused by bacteria. There was just one pair of researchers at the time who were trying to show that flu was a virus rather than bacterial, but the field wasn't having it. It had converged prematurely on the wrong theory. If more folks had joined them at the time, it's possible that it wouldn't have taken another 10 or 15 years to discover that influenza is caused by a virus, and it's possible that lives could have been saved. I want to argue that something like that is going on right now. When science proceeds normally, you have these cycles where the pendulum swings back and forth in terms of the dominant alternatives that people are looking at. We started with our good old-fashioned AI models being symbolic, and then the statistical revolution happened in the early 90s, and we got extremely corpus-driven. And then we went back and said, wait, we need some linguistic knowledge, and people started using linguistic annotations to get knowledge into these models instead of writing down the knowledge or writing rules, and so forth. It goes back and forth. In the normal progression of science, there are these cycles of exploration where competing ideas are in play and different ones may be dominant, and exploitation where there's a greater convergence on the most promising approaches. In the 1918 flu epidemic, there was premature convergence on the bacterial theory, and ideas that still should have been getting explored weren't. And I think that's where we are right now with LLMs. Their behavior is so impressive that the ability to pursue alternative approaches is all but disappearing. And as I've argued here, we're so enraptured by their surface behavior that we're not thinking carefully enough about what it means for a language model to be a cognitive model. We can argue about root causes, but surely one of them is how much money there is now going into using LLMs for natural language processing. We have companies with billions upon billions of dollars at stake leaning into the idea that this is the way to do things. And academic research has followed suit, not just because the models are impressive, which they truly can be, but because if you're a PhD student doing NLP-related work and you want a job, or your faculty applying for funding, most of the time now you're going to be expected to have skills working with these models. But as neuroscientist Stuart Firestein argues in his book Failure, Why Science is So Successful, pluralism in scientific approaches is really important. He points out that if you're searching for somebody who's lost in the woods, it's not a great idea to send everybody searching for them down the same path. And yet, that's pretty much what we're doing now. I think it's worth stepping back and thinking about whether or not that's a good idea, especially because, as I've said, there are other games in town. If we really want to understand how language and cognition work, we need more than just one really promising path. We need to search the whole forest. Thanks for watching this video. I don't know if you come away agreeing with me or not, but the most important outcome here is not for you to agree with my point of view. What's important, agree or disagree, is for people to stop just assuming that it makes sense to think of LLMs as cognitive models because they are so good at language. And instead, to think through what it means to be a cognitive model, to discuss where and how LLMs fit into those goals. I hope this video may have been useful, and I hope folks will now go out there and have that discussion.